Welcome, everyone. My name is Paul Salem, Senior Vice President for Research and Programs here at MEI. Thank you for coming out in the last hours before the Thanksgiving rush. We appreciate it. We know there's not many people left in town. It gives me great pleasure to welcome Mr. Nader Hashemi and Mr. Danny Postel, editors of a new and excellent volume on sectarianization and, sectarianization, mapping the new politics of the Middle East. A number of very excellent chapters, some thematic, some case studies, but I really think an extremely valuable contribution to the field of Middle East studies and understanding the current dynamics of the region. Nader and Danny were here at the Mesa conference in Washington, D.C., so thank you for adding MEI to your stops in town. MEI held its annual banquet and dinner last week. We don't have much programming left between now and the Christmas holidays, but I do want to draw your attention to our annual Turkey conference. That's co-organized with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation. That will take place on Monday, December 4. If you want to register for that, everything's online, and you can also see smaller events and all of our publications on our website, mei.edu. Let me introduce our two panelists, and then we'll get right to it. Dr. Hashemi is Associate Professor at the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, and he's Director of the Center for Middle East Studies there. Welcome, Nader. And Mr. Danny Postel, to my left, is Assistant Director of the Program on Middle East and North African Studies at Northwestern University. And prior to that, he was Associate Director of Middle East Studies at the University of Denver. So I imagine that's where your collaboration started. They have a presentation which they will share time in presenting for about the first half hour. Then I will pitch a few questions to Nader and Danny, and then turn it over to you. And we hope to end sharply at 4:30. So Nader or Danny, whoever wants to go first, thank you for coming, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm honored to be here. When I was an undergraduate student, the Middle East Journal and the Middle East Institute was quite formative in shaping my own understanding of the region. I'm happy to be here. I'm also happy to see one of our former interns at our Center for Middle East Studies, Dominic Nelson, who actually played a role in putting this book together here in the audience and working at the Institute. So I'm very happy to see him here as well. Major world leaders, public intellectuals, policy analysts, and media commentators have sought to explain the current turmoil and instability in the Middle East today as a function of ancient blood feuds rooted in primordial hatreds and antagonisms between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. These conflicts, we are told, have been brewing beneath the surface since the dawn of Islam. Authoritarian strongmen had managed to keep a lid on these enduring rivalries, but with the unraveling of their control as a result of the Arab uprisings, this alleged perennial feature of Muslim societies, rooted in unyielding intolerance, has surfaced to the top, producing the current chaos and turmoil that's afflicting the region. Now, one of the biggest proponents of this particular thesis has been none other than US President Barack Obama. On several occasions, President Obama has spoken of, quote, ancient sectarian differences as a means of explaining the conflict in Syria. These ancient divisions, he asserted, propel the instability in the Arab world, which are, quote, rooted in conflicts that date back millennia. Other prominent American politicians, both Republican and Democratic, have made similar claims. For example, Mitch McConnell, the majority leader of the US Senate, has observed that what is taking place in the Arab world today is, quote, a religious conflict that has been brewing on for a millennium and a half. Mainstream journalists and political commentators, both on the left and the right, have made similar claims. Just to cite one of them, we actually chronicle all of these quotations and this narrative in the beginning of the book, but none other than New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman has asserted that, quote, the main issue in Yemen today is the 7th century struggle over who is the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad, Shia or Sunnis. These respectable voices have also other respectable voices have also contributed to this particular narrative, not just politicians, but also people in the policy community and some academics. A variation of this thesis has been advanced by none other than Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, who has noted that in describing and trying and in seeking to explain the turmoil in the Middle East, that a key factor that explains the instability in the Middle East today is that this is a region that is a deeply flawed part of the world that never came to terms with modernity, a variation on the ancient sectarian thesis argument. Do these observations, we ask in the book, help us understand sectarian conflict in the Middle East today? The problem with the ancient sectarian hatred thesis is that it assumes something constant about religion and culture and its propensity to produce violence, while failing to explain the stark variation in civil conflict over time. In other words, it fails to answer the why now question. Why has sectarian conflict in the Middle East increased at this particular point in time and not before? Our book forcefully challenges the lazy Orientalist reliance on sectarianism as a catch-all explanation for the ills afflicting the Middle East today. We propose as a counter-narrative or counter-concept the term sectarianization in contrast to sectarianism. Sectarianization is an active process, we argue, shaped by political actors operating within specific contexts, pursuing political goals that involve the mobilization of popular sentiments around particular identity markers. Class dynamics, fragile states, and geopolitical rivalries also shape the sectarianization process. The usual term sectarianism is typically devoid of such references. It seems to imply, the term sectarianism that is, some sort of a static trans-historical force, an alleged enduring and immutable characteristic of Arab and Muslim societies from the 7th century until today. The theme of political authoritarianism is central to the sectarianization thesis. In other words, you cannot understand the problem of sectarian conflict today in the Middle East unless you enter the debate from the perspective of political authoritarianism and the many crises that it has produced. This form of political rule has long dominated the politics of the Middle East, and its corrosive legacy has deeply sullied the polities and societies of the region. Authoritarianism, and not theology, is the critical factor in the sectarianization process. Authoritarian regimes in the Middle East have deliberately and purposefully manipulated sectarian identities in various ways as a strategy of deflecting demands for political change and perpetuating their hold to power. This anti-democratic political context is essential for understanding sectarian conflict in Muslim societies today, especially in those societies that contain a mix of Sunni and Shia populations. To paraphrase from that famous aphorism from the Prussian general von Clausewitz, who wrote that war was the continuation of politics by other means, in our reading, sectarian conflict in the Middle East today is primarily about the perpetuation of political rule via identity mobilization. So to make better sense of the sectarianization process, we rely on the literature in the social sciences that deals with ethnic political mobilization. In the social sciences, in the literature on ethnic political mobilization, you actually have 3 schools of thought that seek to explain how people are mobilized around particular identity markers: primordialism, instrumentalism, and constructivism. I won't bore you with the theoretical background, but among those schools of thought that I think help us understand the question of sectarian or religious political mobilization, constructivism adopts a middle ground between the 2 extremes, primordialism and instrumentalism. The proponents argue that religious identity is not fixed, but it is rather a political construct based on a dense web of social relationships that are formed in the context of modernity. Like primordialists, constructivists recognize the importance of seemingly immutable features of ethnic and religious identity, but they disagree that this inevitably produces or leads to conflict. On the other hand, constructivists share that with instrumentalists with a view that elites and leadership play an absolutely important critical role in the mobilization of populations around identity markers. Disagreement emerges, however, over the degree to which identities can actually be manipulated and mobilized. In brief, constructivists do not believe that ethnicity or religion is inherently conflictual, but rather that conflict flows from what are called pathological social systems and political opportunity structures that breed conflict from multiple social cleavages that are beyond the control of a single individual. With this framework as a backdrop, sectarianism in the Middle East today, I think, becomes a little bit more intelligible and understandable. Sectarian identities could not be mobilized in the first place unless there were differences in beliefs and historical memory that compelled religious groups into collective action around particular identities. Therefore, two critical questions emerge. Why are these conflicts intensifying now, and why, in some parts of the Middle East, more so than in others? In other words, what explains the flaring of sectarian conflict at specific moments in time and in specific regions in time and not in others? Sunni-Shia relations, for example, were not always conflict-ridden, nor was sectarianism a strong political force in the modern politics of the Muslim world until relatively recently. How did Syrians and Iraqis, for example, over the course of their sort of modern history, coexist with one another without massive bloodshed, and why are these things happening at this particular moment in time? The level of intensity of conflict also explains or demands some explanation as well. And so this is what our book fundamentally is interested in. There's one particular chapter that I think is the strongest chapter, and that's the chapter by Vali Nass, a prominent political scientist and currently the dean of the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Study. He draws attention to the fact that in the past, theories of ethnic conflict have generally treated the state as a passive actor in identity mobilization. The standard narrative held that competition from within society among contending groups would inevitably shift to the arena of the state as these sub-actors vie for control of various state institutions as a means of enhancing their power over rival groups. The intensification of these struggles would eventually then lead to state weakness, collapse, and the failure of the state. Drawing upon research from South Asia and Pakistan in particular, Vali Nass has suggested, however, that far from being a passive victim of identity mobilization, states, in fact, have a logic of their own and can directly be instrumental in manipulating protagonists and entrenching identity cleavages. Identity mobilization here is rooted in the project of the power acquisition of state actors. These state actors do not champion the cause necessarily of one particular community, but see political gain in the conflict between competing groups. And I think Vali Nass's insights here helps deepen our theoretical understanding of how the process of identity mobilization takes place, the reasons for it, the drivers of it. So in conclusion, the key claim that our book seeks to make is that sectarianism, in and of itself, fails to explain the current disorder and instability in the Middle East. This widely held view, based on an alleged enduring Sunni-Shia chasm, clouds rather than illuminates the complex realities of the politics of the region, which are better understood in a series of developmental crises, both economic and political, that the region has been facing since World War II. The policies of leading Western liberal democracies toward the Middle East have only exacerbated these problems. While it is true that religious identities now are much more salient, much more relevant in the politics of the Middle East than they were before, it's also true that these identities have been deliberately politicized by state actors in pursuit of political gain. The politics of authoritarian regimes is the key context for understanding this problem. In other words, there is a deeply symbiotic relationship between pressure from below, which demands greater inclusion, respect, and representation, versus refusal by ruling elites from above to share or relinquish power. This produces a crisis of legitimacy that needs to be carefully managed, and the politics of sectarianism, or sectarianization more accurately, the deliberate manipulation of religious identities, is the result of this political dynamic. Notwithstanding the rhetoric that we hear from some Sunni monarchies in the Middle East, or for some presidents of life in the various Arab republics, ruling elites are not necessarily truly embedded and connected and committed to defending a particular sectarian identity. The driver of politics is not really the defense of theological doctrine or loyalty to the collective interests of a religious sect. The core allegiance for ruling elites in the Middle East is really to their own political thrones and to the various clients, whether Sunni or Shia, who can help sustain them in power. What is really salient here, in other words, is not religious piety, but the pursuit of political power. As Madawi al-Rashid writes in our volume, sectarianism is not an inherently historical quality of the Middle East or of the Arab masses. There are sectarian entrepreneurs and religious scholars who continue to flourish in the present by manipulating these identities in the interest of ruling regimes and often at their specific request. Sectarianism, in other words, is a modern political phenomenon that is nourished by authoritarian regimes whose rule depends on invoking these age-old religious identities that become lethally politicized at particular moments in time. In short, sectarianism does not explain the current turmoil in the Middle East. Political authoritarianism does. And let me just end on one sort of final note, trying to connect what's happening in the Middle East today with what's happening in this country. We've seen over the last year a rise in conflict between different groups. It's not sectarian conflict, it's much more racial conflict. We can see it in terms of how African Americans are being mobilized and how we've seen this new populist mobilization around a particular white nationalist identity. Tensions have risen significantly. We haven't seen this before in the last, let's say, 8 years of the Obama presidency, which raises the question, why is this happening right now? Look at what happens in Charlottesville over the summer, in Ferguson, in St. Louis. Look at the opinion polls in terms of how people view other different racial groups. And the key difference, the key, I think, explanatory variable that explains this new type of racial conflict between different groups was the election of Donald Trump, who purposely and deliberately has played the white nationalist card in his sentiments and in his comments as a way of mobilizing a particular set of people in this country around his political agenda. And so while the Middle East and the United States is very different, the process and the dynamic of how people are mobilized around a set of particular identity markers is not that different. And so if we can understand what's happening in this country today with Donald Trump and how he's used as a political leader, he's tried to mobilize people around a particular set of identity markers. If we can understand that topic in this country, it should be somewhat more easy to understand what's happening in the Middle East today as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. Thank you very much. It's fascinating, and I know very brief attempt at explaining a very complex topic raises a number of questions that I'll get to afterwards. But Danny, it's your turn.
Thank you. Can you hand me the clicker?
Yes. I think you have to have your slide set up there.
What's that?
Your slide isn't up there yet.
There we go.
There we go.
Thank you very much.
Just it'll be launched.
Okay. Do I launch it?
No, I think he's gonna come
Okay,
and launch
great.
it.
Thank you.
Prepare for launch.
And then this is just forward.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to the Middle East Institute for hosting this discussion. Like Nader, I've been reading the Middle East Journal for many years, and I'm a frequent visitor to the MEI website and a huge fan of several of the scholars who have adorned the halls of this fine institution over the years. And thank you particularly to Paul Salem for chairing this discussion. So I'd like to just put a little bit of flesh on the bones of the kind of big picture, theoretical, historical perspective that Nader has just outlined by historicizing sectarianization, or placing this process on the map of time, if you will. Shadi Hamid, I think, captured this issue very, very well in this quote, where he says there's a temporal problem with the ancient hatreds thesis, and it applies just as much to Syria or Lebanon today as it did to the Balkans in the 1990s. If there is something constant about a culture and its predisposition to violence, then how can we explain stark variations in civil conflict over short periods of time? I think this really gets to the heart of the matter and to illustrate just how short the periods of time we're talking about are, let's go back just a few years, 11 years, to the summer of 2006. It's almost inconceivable now, but you might remember that in the summer of 2006, the two most popular figures in Arab public opinion polls in the Sunni Arab world were in fact two Shiites. One, not even an Arab, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the then president of Iran, and Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah. Almost inconceivable now. And we won't get into exactly why they were the two most popular figures. They're certainly not two of my favorite figures, but they were highly popular figures in the Sunni Arab world. And that's just 11 years ago. It's almost inconceivable that that could be the case today. Why? I try to capture that in two photos. Okay, there they are again together, joined by a particular individual whose policies have engendered the photo on the right. Okay? In a word, the Syrian Catastrophe. Now, there's an awful lot of reading history backwards going on with this new conventional wisdom that Nader talked about, this sectarian narrative. In our view, the three key turning points in this very recent history of the sectarianization process are 1979, 2003, and then 2011. That dash after 2011 is significant because if you just nail it onto the year 2011, there's an implication, sometimes explicit, that it was the Arab uprisings themselves, these popular mobilizations that unleashed these sectarian demons on the region. I reject that reading. In fact, the uprisings of 2011 had little, if anything, to do with sectarianism and had everything to do with more general demands for social justice and democratic rights. But I'll explain that in a moment. So we imagine the Saudi-Iranian rivalry that has come to dominate the politics of the region and define its fault lines as somehow eternal. But in fact, if you go back to the pre-1979 period, in the 1960s and early to mid-70s, Iran and Saudi Arabia got along quite well. They had a lot in common. They were both monarchies. They were both pro-Western, both oil-rich states. There's nothing inherent or necessary or intrinsic or inevitable about the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. It's a political, geopolitical story. Now, Yemen is back in the news, and the geopolitical coordinates of the Yemeni conflict today, we imagine, again, as Nader mentioned, Tom Friedman, who thinks that we have to understand the Yemeni conflict in terms of the 7th century dispute over who would be the rightful heir to the Prophet Muhammad, a truly nonsensical formulation. It's one of those cases where invoking history makes you sound like you have a deep argument, but actually these invocations of the 7th century to try to explain the politics of the region today are actually profoundly ahistorical. Look at, if you remember the regional rivalries and the regional alliances that defined the Yemeni conflict of the 1960s, they had nothing to do with sect or religion. They had to do with regime-type Cold War alliances and ideological positions. So the Saudis and the Iranians and the Jordanians, all monarchies, sided with, guess whom? The monarchy in Yemen. Nasser and his allies in the Arab nationalist camp sided with, guess whom? The Republican forces, their fellow Republicans in Yemen. But we imagine that somehow, because today the fault lines in the Yemeni conflict, in the terms of the regional politics, seem to be sectarian in nature, they must always have been that way. Far from it. So, of course, this little event takes place in 1979. You all know how that goes. But the real question is not the Iranian Revolution itself, but the aftershocks of the revolution. And there were many, but I'm just going to focus on two. One is the Iran-Iraq War. Now, we don't think of Saddam Hussein as a particularly sectarian character, but he was freaked out by the Iranian Revolution for domestic as well as regional reasons. He was terrified that his majority Shia population in Iraq would rise up against him, inspired by the example of their Shia brethren across the border in Iran. And so he invades Iran and launches a basically decade-long, bloody and pointless and horribly destructive war. And then there's something else that takes place in the 1980s. Two things. One is that Saudi Arabia also mobilizes not a military invasion, but an ideological response, an ideological campaign across the Sunni world to counter the Iranian message and push back against this Shia revolutionary model. And then, of course, you also have the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which we didn't think of in sectarian terms in the 1980s, when Sunni jihadis from all over the world were flocking to Afghanistan to push back the Soviet invaders. It didn't seem to have a sectarian character. It was anti-communist, anti-foreign invader. In fact, the seeds for the Sunni anti-Shia extremism that come to the fore later, many of them are planted during this transnational jihad in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we forget, there was a period of cold peace, more or less, between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And then this little thing happens in 2003, sending shockwaves, again, through the region. And we can debate when exactly it happens. Bobby Ghosh, I think, exaggerates, but it's an interesting claim. He says that the August 29th, 2003 bombing of the Imam Ali Shrine in Najaf is the bomb that started the Middle East sectarian war. I mean, I think that's an exaggerated claim, but the reason I use this slide is to remind ourselves that this violence, this sectarian violence, begins very quickly after the US invasion of Iraq, in the very first few months. And of course, over the next several years, you have episode after episode of sectarian wreckage that rattles Iraq and also has regional spillover. You have what I call a sectarian metastasis that is embodied in these two figures, to cut a long story short, from Zarqawi to Baghdadi. And then, of course, you have this flare-up in 2016 with the Saudi the execution of Nimr al-Nimr, the Shia imam in Saudi Arabia, and Iran vows a divine vengeance on Saudi Arabia as a result, and there are these protests and torching of the embassy. And then in response, you have Mohammed bin Salman, who's much more in the news now than he was then. And these are just headlines from The Guardian and the New York Times. Iran is seeking to control the Islamic world, he claims, which is a view that becomes more and more common throughout the Sunni world. Talk of a Shia crescent, Iranian hegemony, Iran controlling 5 Arab capitals. This kind of war of narratives really takes hold. Now, 2011. These Arab uprisings, again, reading history backwards, people imagine that this was always about sectarianism. There are diplomats and scholars and pundits who refer to the Sunni uprising in Syria. What Sunni uprising? The uprising in Syria had nothing to do with sect. It had everything to do with the demands of their Tunisian and Egyptian counterparts: bread, freedom, justice, human dignity, and democratic rights. One of the greatest slogans of the Syrian uprising was neither Salafi nor brother, meaning Muslim brother. My sect is freedom. That wasn't just a quaint sentiment. That was actually something that people embodied. So if you look at the sociological composition of the people on the streets in Syria between March 2011 and approximately October, November 2011, you see a wide cross-section of Syrian society. Of course, you see Sunni Arabs being the majority of the population, but you see many Alawis, Kurds, Ismailis, Armenians, Druze, atheist and secular Syrians. And what was the response of these regimes to these non-sectarian, largely popular uprisings, I think that the response of the Assad regime can be summed up in 2 words: live ammunition, crushing these demonstrations. And in Bahrain, it's the same story, but the flip sectarian equation, where you have a Sunni minority regime crushing a Shia majority uprising, but not a Shia uprising. Let's be clear. Again, in Bahrain, which was a much gentler uprising in terms of the demands and slogans, they weren't even calling for the end of the regime. They were calling for reforms and democratic rights. And there were Sunni and Shia in the streets. Of course, what's the narrative of both regimes? The Assad regime responds by calling this an al-Qaeda-inspired terrorist foreign plot against the Syrian people. And the Bahraini regime responds to its very gentle, nonviolent, cross-sectarian uprising as an Iranian plot, a foreign plot meant aiming to destabilize the regime. The theorist Jean-Pierre Filiu describes the response of these regimes across the region to these uprisings as a counter-revolution. And in our book, Madawi al-Rashid, who has a great chapter on Saudi Arabia titled Sectarianism as Counter-Revolution, she looks at how Saudi Arabia responded to the uprisings around the region in a very deliberate way to squash them and to send a message. As Nader was saying, it's a classic scapegoating move. You have problems, you have grievances, you have demands, but it's not us, it's not our corrupt rule or our repression or our mafia capitalist states. It's not us, it's those guys, it's the other sect. They're the ones causing all the problems. So then you have, in the geopolitics of the region, Saudi Arabia puts together this so-called decisive storm coalition, which deepens the sectarianization process and is responsible for war crimes and one of the worst humanitarian catastrophes in recent memory. Just the other day, this is a headline from the New York Times, the Saudi blockade of Yemen threatens to starve millions, according to the United Nations. Now, we have our very special, that is a very memorable photo, and it's not photoshopped, by the way. But this is, I mean, there's a kind of absurd, cartoonish, preposterous quality to this moment, but it had very serious policy implications. Within 3 days of that summit, the Orb Fest, the sword dance, within 3 days, you saw immediate action taken by all of these regimes. Bahrain bans its only remaining opposition party. Egypt cracks down further, deepens its crackdown on civil society, bans newspapers and jails activists, and Saudi Arabia intensifies its bombing campaign in Yemen. Because they read Trump's green light and this love fest as America has our back. And this is only deepening the sectarianization process that was already in full swing. This is only going to make things worse. These are just 2 headlines, actually, capturing this. Bahrain follows Trump trip with dissent crackdown. U.S. Saudi Arabia seal weapons. U.S. and Saudi Arabia seal weapons deal worth nearly $10 billion immediately and $350 billion over 10 years. This posture of the United States is not going to help de-sectarianize the region. It is only going to help deepen this crisis. And that's the note on question of what would it take to even think about de-sectarianization or putting, at least attenuating, if not reversing, this poisonous process that has come to dominate the region's politics. We, and our contributor, Tim Sisk, who's not a Middle East expert, but a comparative political scientist, he draws on the cases of Northern Ireland, Bosnia, Sri Lanka, other societies that have seen deep religious and ethnic violence, that have been torn apart by these identitarian differences, and that have come where the violence has come to an end. What lessons might be learned from those cases? I will just say that I'm not optimistic in the short term, but I think it's important in the end to really think seriously about how the United States, the international community, and players in the region can think about what it would take to de-sectarianize or reverse this horrific process?
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, both of you. Very interesting and fascinating remarks, and I'm sure the book is as well. I haven't had a chance to read through it. I have a number of sort of reflections and questions in no particular order. Danny, I very much liked sort of the historicization and the attempt to go back, not to look backwards at history, but to see important pivot points, and I very much agree with you about 79, 2003, 2011. I'd add to 1979 the takeover of the Great Mosque in Mecca by Sunni Islamic extremists, which was another shock, obviously, to the Saudi monarchy, which was always Islamic in veneer, but never took that as a necessarily urgent thing to highlight. So I think that is an important also marker. 79 was also the final stage in Egypt's departure from leading the Arab world. The Camp David and finally the peace treaty in 1979. And when you look at sectarianism or sectarianization in the 80s or 90s, as opposed to what the mood was in the 50s and 60s, there was almost no sectarianism or sectarianization at the time when Egypt was the leading player in Arab nationalism and socialism, so that the isolation of Egypt and the rise of Saudi Arabia and Iran, that shift in power was very, very clear. I also want to put on the table sort of 1967 as a symbol of a deeper problem, and this is something that I wanted both of your views on, which is sort of the profound failure of a number of modern attempts, you know, the nation state, Arab nationalism, the welfare state Arab version, and the defeat of 67 was sort of the marker that kind of deflated a lot of those modernist ambitions. But to turn that into a question, that beyond the crisis of authoritarianism or the fight between Iran and Saudi Arabia, there is something more profound taking place, that people indeed no longer find modernity or nationalism, or some people don't find those as succeeding or providing an answer, and then a turn either to religion, generally speaking, or a sectarian version of religion is a profound thing, and not just necessarily an invented sort of marker. So I'd like your views on that. Also, there are some, to use shorthand, sectarian groups for whom sectarianism is just a marker. You know, we're Sunnis, you're Shia, we fight, we're fighting for power, there's nothing profound about it. But take the Islamic Revolution in Iran, no, it made a religious interpretation into a political project, and a state, and a revolution, and a global, with a global vision. And you take, for example, the Lebanese Shiites, who've, there's sectarian issues in Lebanon, but it went to something more profound, that no, we are part of a different project, which is, religious, political, sectarian, but in a deep sense. The same can be said of a sectarian group like ISIS. There's Sunni militias who just fight because they're Sunni, and then there's a group like ISIS that says, well, our interpretation of Sunni Islam is profound, and we're going to create an Islamic state, and it goes well beyond sectarianism. And how can you differentiate, or do you, in the study, in the book that is there? I also want to pose a question that you sort of hint at when you went to the U.S., and that, this is something that's happening all over the world. Part of that, I wanted your reflections on how much of this is the result of globalization, social media prior to that people are organizing in these atavistic communal ways just because that's the way modern life or communication is, ? A second, more political question, you take some sectarian movements, take the Shia in Lebanon or the Shia in Iraq, that sectarian mobilization was actually a means of empowerment and a means for them to get ahead. And here my question is, to what degree are we sort of preemptively saying sectarianism is is always a negative thing? And, or is it sometimes, or do you define the negative aspects in a specific way? Because for some people, well, that's just the way they mobilized against oppression, and they're free to do it. They can join a communist party, or they can join a Sunni party, but that is, part of it is mobilizational and possibly a positive thing. Fourth question relating to your link to authoritarian regimes. That obviously, yes, authoritarianism is sort of the pattern of the whole region, but how do you sort of systematically differentiate between authoritarian regimes that promote, but that don't promote sectarianism? I mean, you take Sisi in Egypt, say a lot of things about it, but he's promoting a nationalist authoritarian thing. That's the way he does it. The Algerians have another way. Assad, he plays with sectarianism, very complex, but his main message is not, as a message, is not sectarianism. So authoritarianism can dampen sectarianism or stamp it out or try to, or like in the case of maybe Saudi Arabia and Iran, for the reasons that you both mentioned, they can fan it. But they're both authoritarian, and how do we find the link there? And my final question is to ask the question you asked, the what do we do question. I know that's too many issues and questions, but I find this topic extremely fascinating, and I come from a very sectarianized country,
Of course, yeah.
Lebanon, so I'm sensitive to it. In any order that you guys want to...
Okay, Paul, those are great observations and questions. Let me sort of take them in reverse order. I think the difference with el-Sisi in Egypt, in contrast to Saudi Arabia, Iran, Syria, is that in the case of Egypt, as you all know or should know, that the question of a Sunni-Shia sort of divide and ability to mobilize people around those identities doesn't exist. So it's authoritarianism, and it's still, I think, responsible for producing a lot of ugliness and violence, but it's a different form of authoritarianism. The question of sectarianism doesn't really manifest itself in the way that we're talking in the book, which is why we don't have an Egypt chapters, because there's not a mix of Sunni Shia populations, and those types of cleavages and historical memories can't be mobilized. But your broader point that you sort of began with, which is a really good observation, is very much connected to the fundamental political paralysis and crisis that the region has been facing for many decades now. And your reference to 1967 is actually a very astute observation, because 1967 basically is the turning point for those of us who teach the modern politics of the region, where the belief, the hope in some form of secular political project, secular Arab nationalism primarily, starts to fail. The promises of Gamal Abdel Nasser that this was the paradigm all come crashing to the ground in those 6 days in the June War. And that's considered to be the relative turning point when people started to look for other answers. If the secular promises of the post-colonial state rooted in these nationalist promises were not delivering on the promises that they made, well, then people don't just roll over and die. They look for other paradigms, other projects, other ideologies, and that's when you begin to see the shift to different forms of politicized religion. And then the Iranian Revolution is the key turning point that brings political Islam to power, but it just wasn't, as we know, an Iranian phenomenon. This is a broader regional trend where politicized Islam effectively starts to replace different forms of secular forms of politics, whether it was nationalist secular politics or different forms of left-wing. We forget that for much of the modern history, at least of the region post-World War I, that the form of politics was secular, either in a nationalist sense or in a left-wing sort of socialist and communist sense. And it was cross-sectarian, because you had people who had backgrounds from Sunni, Shia, or other minorities who were involved in communist parties, left-wing parties, socialist parties, and nationalist parties.
Disproportionately.
Disproportionately. And so, in many ways, your observation is so, I think, poignant and astute, because it highlights the fundamental, I think, set of social and political conditions that is really at the heart of the region's turmoil and instability. And it's not sectarianism or the surfacing of these ancient blood feuds that we often hear in the political discussion here in the West, but it's really about the failure of political governance. It's the failure of a broken political system that hasn't been able to deliver on the promises that political leaders make about higher standards of living, social justice, representation, a distribution of the economic political pie. And these authoritarian regimes face these, as I said in my remarks, these political challenges from below. And the way that they respond to these political challenges, primarily demands for democracy, in a nutshell, is they play the sectarian card. They blame it on others. Our book actually has several case studies, the Bahrain chapter, the Saudi chapter, and specifically the Syria chapter, where we actually document exactly how the ruling elites in those countries played the sectarian card as a way of deflecting attention from their own corrupt and incompetent rule. Number one, to divide the opposition within those societies, to try and sectarianize those opposition groups so that they become less forceful, but also to send a message to the international community to say that, look, what's happening in our countries is not demands for political change. What's happening in our country is not the legacy of corrupt authoritarian rule, but what's happening in our country is external factors, external players trying to intervene. And then in some cases, the problems in our country, the theory goes, is extremism, is al-Qaeda. I mean, that's exactly the narrative that the Assad regime used to send a message to the global community that the fundamental source of conflict in Syria is not political authoritarianism or the almost 50 years of one family rule, but it's ISIS, it's al-Qaeda, international community, come and join us and we have a common enemy.
War on terror.
And sadly, what's so tragic about at least the case of Syria is that the international community broadly is bought into that narrative. Has sort of, because we don't talk about the question of, dictatorship or authoritarianism or demands for democracy. So fundamentally, the failure of the state project, the post-colonial secular national state, and it's really a failure not just of the state itself, because the state doesn't exist by itself. It's those political actors, those ruling families, those clans, some but not all of them supported by the West, who've presided over this complete deterioration and collapse of an entire region, of whose only beneficiary is radical extremist groups who could then mobilize people and basically tell them, look, there's no hope for you to get any justice, to bring about political change within the institutions, within the framework of existing nation states. The only chance is to come and join our utopic revolutionary nationalist or revolutionary radical agenda that can bring about some change, possibly. And so, this is fundamentally, I think, what's at the root of these types of political processes, of which sectarianism really is just a reflection of the broken politics of the Middle East.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Paul, thank
Danny?
you. I mean, this has been a treat to get such thoughtful and interesting questions that push us in these directions. Just a couple. I would say that with 1967, that's a really great point. It's obviously a major pivot point in the region's history. It seems to me, and I need to investigate this further and formulate my thoughts on this point more, but it seems to me that now there's a kind of a nostalgia for Arab nationalism, because you look at the region today, you see jihadism, you see monarchies, you see repression, you see war, and you think, remember a time when the politics of the region were defined by these more modern, enlightened ideologies, secular movements like Arab nationalism, pan-Arabism, socialism? And I understand that impulse, but the fact is, Arab nationalism failed for a lot of reasons. One of them is that it never ran deep. It was wide. It was a movement that did, in fact, take hold in several countries, and Nasser, became a major player on the global stage. But to what extent did Arab nationalism really take root at a grassroots level amongst the masses in those societies? The answer is basically not very much. Now, we can debate why that is, but here's just a little anecdote about, that we all say that that Arab nationalism died at the end of the Six-Day War in June 1967. If Arab nationalist ideas were really salient, if they really spoke to the region's key issues, would a military defeat that summer have destroyed an entire worldview, an entire political ideology? I doubt it. I think it was a very weak movement. It was an important one historically. And in retrospect, it looks amazing. People miss it. But let's not over-romanticize the Arab nationalists. They were not democratic. Many of them were deeply authoritarian. They had their moment. Nasser did bring a lot of developmental changes and in terms of fighting poverty and bringing women into the society. There's no question, but let's not over-romanticize. There's a lot of Arab nationalism nostalgia these days that I think is a little too simplistic. In terms of, God, there were so many good questions. Hezbollah is an interesting case where, again, I showed that photo of Ahmadinejad and Nasrallah. When Hezbollah's primary identity and purpose and raison d'etre was fighting Israeli aggression in Lebanon, it had huge, that's not a sectarian issue. That's a territorial issue. It's an issue of, that has to do with other questions. And so that's why so many Sunni Arabs were generally sympathetic to Hezbollah, and atheists and Christians as well. But Hezbollah has redefined itself in terms of the Syrian conflict. Hezbollah went all in and completely redesigned its strategy in the Syrian theater. And in so doing, it sectarianized, it hyper-sectarianized its purpose. Hezbollah is now functioning essentially as a death squad, a mass death squad in Syria, murdering civilians. Now you can say, it's fighting ISIS, right? The Iranian narrative and the Hezbollah narrative is we're fighting ISIS. Well, guess what? There was no ISIS when Hezbollah and Iran took the side of the Assad regime when it was opening fire on peaceful demonstrators. So that's another case of reading history backwards, a self-serving narrative. In any case, there's a lot of self-sectarianization. I think your larger point, maybe I'm reading into your question, Paul, is Nader and I tend to emphasize a lot sectarianization from above, how regimes and authoritarian leaders sectarianize conflict after conflict to perpetuate their rule. We do, and it's not the only part of sectarianization. There's also sectarianization from below. There are sectarian entrepreneurs. There are imams and social formations that actually take the bait of, or have their own sectarian agendas. So let's be clear. Authoritarianism, the authoritarian leaders are not the only source of sectarianization. They just happen to be the most powerful ones. And if you were to replace these authoritarian leaders with, let's say, governance that reflected more of a majority popular will, would that mean that sectarianism would disappear overnight? Of course not. Look at Iraq. Now, democracy, such as it is, came to Iraq in a particularly violent and problematic way, but nonetheless, there were elections. And those elections produced a Shia, identitarian, majoritarian, sectarian state, which wasn't in and of itself the problem. That's your other question. Is sectarianism always... A lot of Shia Iraqis felt empowered by the removal of Saddam Hussein and the creation of this electoral process. They did, and that's legitimate. They had grievances. The problem is the majoritarian way in which they governed and the exclusion and in some cases violent repression of Sunnis, Sunni Iraqis. And that's not necessary, that's not inevitable, right? But it is what happened, and it's not surprising that after decades of Saddam's torture state and the particular sectarian equation by which Saddam ruled, it's not surprising that when people finally get their chance, that they don't practice Swedish social democracy and pluralism.
The Swedes used to be very violent. That's true. Not to be put too much of a gloss on them. Before going to the audience, you did not answer, what do we do?
Yeah, great question. Yeah.
No,
You tell us.
Well, I want to shamefully use this opportunity to say, well, what do we do in terms of No, that's actually the current book. The last chapter deals with it, so go out and buy it. That's what we can do
it's
first
for
step.
sale, $20 right at the...
So that's the first step.
Okay.
But much more directly to your question, the first thing that has to happen is the violence has to stop. The killing has to stop as a first preliminary measure. And then as we sort of argue in the book, because we strongly believe and argue that sectarianism is a byproduct of the politics of authoritarianism, there has to be some envisioning of a way out of this authoritarian conundrum that produces these types of politics. Democratic transitions, representative government, strong constitutions that give minority groups and majority groups a seat at the table, where they can write new constitutions with strong legal guarantees that can be then enforced. If we leave it in the hands of these authoritarian dictators, thinking that they're going to preside over some sort of, political order that's stable over the long term, that's wishful thinking. So that type of arrangement. And also, I would add,
Although, as a parenthesis, as you mentioned, I mean, two out of three countries in the Arab world that are somewhat democratic, those two being Iraq and Lebanon, are also extremely now sectarian and are likely to keep reproducing it. Now, maybe it's not violent, maybe it'll find a way to, but that's an interesting
I would say,
conundrum.
Yeah,
would
I mean,
say.
with respect to Iraq, for all of its failures and its problems, I think having some sort of electoral process in place, having some sort of buy-in where people can argue that, look, rather than taking a gun in hand and sort of violently overthrowing the existing political order, you can cast a ballot.
Sure.
You can vote. That is, I think,
You
a step
can be
in the right
sectarian,
direction.
but
you can
not
be sectarian,
shoot
but not
anybody.
violent. So I
Yeah.
think that is, but lastly, I think, and this speaks to the U.S., the international community has to, I think, change its focus and its policy toward the region. It has to play a much more constructive role in de-sectarianizing the region. Danny mentioned, I believe, the question of Northern Ireland and the conflict between Catholics and Protestants. One of the reasons why that conflict came to an end was strong support from the international community as a factor in mobilizing and bringing the parties together. That shift, I think, and that role was significant. I think that also applies to the case of the Middle East. The international community, I think, has to start to, realize that this Faustian bargain that we've struck with these authoritarian regimes, thinking that they are going to be the guarantors of stability, is a dead end. It's not going to happen. It's actually the root of the problem. And the international community has to be pursuing policies where it tries to bring these sectarian cleavages to an end by forcing the parties, I think, to change their previous ways and promote policies internally within these countries that are much more rooted in good governance policies.
Which is the exact opposite of what the current administration in Washington is doing. It is signing off whole scale on the Saudi narrative. The Saudi narrative is that all of the region's problems are to do with Iran, can be laid at the doorstep of the Islamic Republic. Trump has signed off on that. The Saudis, so this is a great case where what can the international community do? In my view, one of the greatest triumphs of the Obama administration was the Iran nuclear deal. I supported the deal very strongly. At the time, I wrote in favor of it. I lobbied for it. But the Iran nuclear deal was the right thing. It prevented another war in the Middle East. It could have, the idea is that it could have gotten us on a better balance in the region. And yet, paradoxically, the Iran nuclear deal has actually contributed indirectly to a deeper sectarianization of the region's politics. Not directly, but indirectly. How? Because the Saudis flipped out. The Israelis did too. And what did the Obama administration do? They sent John Kerry to go calm the Saudis down. And in exchange to quell them a bit, the United States basically turned a blind eye to Saudi Arabia's war crimes in Yemen. Now, this is only furthering the sectarianization process. And that was the Obama administration. Now you have an administration that openly embraces the Saudi narrative, has taken sides in the sectarian fault lines of the region, deepening the sectarianization process, and actually Trump really likes the dictators. Those are the people he feels most comfortable with. So we've gone completely backwards on all of this.
I'll turn it to the audience. There's a microphone. Introduce yourself and ask your question.
I'm Randall Rahim. First of all, thank you very much for writing a book that debunks this totally specious, backward, as you call it, essentially superficial explanation about, this goes back thousands of years or hundreds of years. I have two questions. First of all, do you have a chapter on Iraq in your book?
Yes.
I'm very glad.
Very
about
good
that.
one.
Thank you. Because, in fact, the situation of Iraq very much illustrates many of the points that you're making. But during the war, the Iran-Iraq war in 1980, it was very significant that Saddam Hussein did not wage that war in the name of sectarianism. He did not call Iran the Shia. He called them al-Furs, the Persians, or he called them at the limit, al-Majus, the
Magi's.
the Magi. It's not really the Magi,
Yeah,
but
it's not exactly,
that
but-
no biblical
Yeah.
connotation.
Yes, yes.
So he fought that war on a nationalist agenda. And in fact, the Iraqis who fought in that war fought it very much as Iraqis rather than as Sunnis and Shias. So I don't know if that comes out in your book, because that's a very interesting sort of, the question is why, what was going on there? My other question is this. You start your chronology, in spite of 67 being an important date, in 1979. Well, 1979 is the date when Ayatollah Khomeini took over power in Iran. Could you explain why you think that was a trigger? You didn't come out and speak about why you think that triggered a chain of actions and reactions, and I would be very interested to hear. I happen to agree with you, but I'd like to hear why you think so. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take another couple of questions. Yeah, please note the question.
Yes, definitely.
So,
Yes, it's on.
okay. Thank you. That was very interesting for me, this discussion. My name is Fariba Pajou. And my question is, according to the Mohammed bin Salman regional movements, particularly his closeness to Israel, should the region be waiting for an actual war, even for a short time? And also I want to know, what do you think about Israel's role in this new situation in the region? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to the left side, the gentleman in that row.
Thank you. Thanks for two fascinating presentations. I'm Morten Valbjørn from Aarhus University. One short remark and two questions. The fact that you don't have Shias in a country does not mean that you don't have anti-Shia sentiments.
Good point.
Egypt, Jordan, to some extent, are places actually where you find anti-Shia sentiments, despite the fact there are almost no Shias. My two questions is, the first is, how do you define sectarianism? I just come from the Mesa conference, and it has been quite interesting to observe that some places sectarianism is about relations between Muslims and Copts. Other places it's about Shia and Sunnis, and so on and so forth. So in your view of the term sectarianism, is it that mainly relations of groups belonging to the same faith, or between faiths, and does it really matter? So what is so sectarian about sectarianism? Is sectarianism just an example of identity politics similar to all other kinds of identity politics, or is it somehow different, and if so, how is it different? And my last question is then that you framed your own theoretical position between primordialism on the one hand, instrumentalism on the other hand, and then you are, of course, in the third in-between, constructivism. But then you emphasize regimes, political power, sectarian and entrepreneurs, and so on and so forth. So I'm curious to know, in which way do you differ from an instrumentalist position then, really?
Thank you. I think that's enough.
Great
questions to go with.
questions.
Danny, you want to go
Indeed.
first?
Sure.
Okay, Saddam's agenda. Very nice question about Iraq in 1979. I mean, there are people in this room, I'm sure, who know much more about it than I do. I highly recommend the chapter in the book on Iraq, which is authored by Fanar Haddad, who I think has been associated with the Middle East Institute and has certainly written for its journal. And what he does is he looks at sectarian relations before sectarianization, if you will, before 2003 in Iraq. And it's a complicated story, as you undoubtedly know better than I do. But you're right that I think there was a dual message from Saddam about it was not explicitly sectarian in a religious sense, but he didn't trust. He often his messaging was often about the Iraqi Shia being closet Persians. He would often refer to them as Persians. Yes, clear. In fact, the day that they hung him, the day of his death.
After a certain date.
Aha, okay, very good. It's good to periodize this, yes. But he did, I mean, so the obvious question is why did he invade Iran then? There are experts on this question far greater than myself, but he certainly feared, and so did other regimes, the Saudis particularly. Let's remember that although the Iranian Revolution was a revolution largely of Shia Muslims, not only, there were also Marxists and nationalists and liberals and feminists and workers involved, but the Khomeinists were explicitly Shia in their theology and revolutionary vision. But that revolution actually had a lot of resonance in the region with Sunni Arabs, with Christians, with atheists, secular forces, because it was seen as a third world revolution, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist revolution, a popular revolution against dictatorship, against pro-Western regimes, and so forth. And it's hard to remember that now, but it's actually quite important to note. I mean, that the revolution inspired it inspired Muslim brothers, it inspired all sorts of people. So there was a backlash, there was a blowback against it. 1979, why did it trigger these shockwaves? I think Nader would have a lot of insights about that. You want to take that one, Nader?
Well, again, a chance to plug the book. Our introduction goes into this quite detailed, so if you want to read a long version of what I'm about to say, purchase the book. 1979 is absolutely crucial because that's when the Iranian Revolution takes place, and it challenges, number one, the Saudi claim to being leaders of the Islamic world. Because the revolution in Iran is explicitly based on a politicized version of Islam, and it's also explicitly announces itself as not being a sectarian revolution, but a Muslim revolution for all Muslims, against colonialism, against imperialism, against pro-Western monarchies. And the Iranian revolutionaries explicitly made comparisons between the Shah of Iran and other pro-Western monarchies in the region, hoping that the same thing that happened in Iran for the same reasons would happen in Saudi Arabia. The Saudi Arabian ruling family and its allies, fearing this wave of revolutionary politicized Islam would come over and affect them. And so it's precisely and exactly for that reason that they start to churn out and provide a different narrative. That revolution on the other side of the Gulf has nothing to do with Islam. It has everything to do with Shia sectarianism, with Persian identity. If you are a good practicing Muslim, forget that revolution. It's a bastardized version of Islam. And you can actually empirically show that from 1979 moving forward, there is a decided increase in the publication of texts, of books, of fatwas that are directed against Shia Muslims as being heretics. That's not a coincidence. It's because of what we actually talk about in the book, the crisis of legitimacy, the fear of authoritarian leaders have with challenges to their rule. And so that fundamentally is why 79 is such a big turning point in the conflict. Now, there's other good questions that have been asked.
That actually relates to the question about anti-Shiism in the absence of Shia,
Yes.
which was a very good question. And Nader has been to Malaysia recently, where you have something very much
Very
along
similar. I
those
mean,
lines.
it's good that you mentioned Egypt and Jordan because there's very few Shia Muslims there, but there's still a lot of anti-Shia sentiment. And part of it has to do with what I just alluded to, the dissemination and the proliferation of arguments, theological texts, schools of puritanical Islam that can be traced back to Saudi Arabia that is rooted in this particular worldview. So I traveled to Malaysia quite frequently over the last few years. Similar situation. There's very few Shia Muslims there, but there's a lot of anti-Shia hysteria. How do you explain that? Well, all roads lead to Saudi Arabia in this case. I mean, I could say more about it, but I think that's fundamentally the problem, and the related problem is the the politics of authoritarianism, blaming it on these heretical other forces that are trying to come and subvert and pollute our pure identity. The question that was asked, secondly, I didn't get the first part of the question, but what is Israel's role in this? Well, Israel isn't directly involved in sectarian conflict in the Middle East, not directly. It has taken sides almost publicly in terms of supporting one particular worldview, and that is basically the Saudi, Emirati, Bahraini sort of Sunni monarchy position, you know. And so it is very much in an open, effective alliance in supporting Saudi Arabia, with Trump and Kushner and Bannon sort of playing quarterback, fueling a new alliance and perpetuating, I think, a particular sectarian narrative indirectly, because Israel views its own interests as being secured by supporting those forces that have a similar reading of the politics of the Middle East and the roots of instability. And so from the perspective of Israel, from the perspective of Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis, it's all Iran's fault. Everything that's happening in the region is Iran's fault. If Iran would just go away, the region would be stable. Now, there's an element of truth to that, but of course it's a gross exaggeration. So I think Israel is simply benefiting from intra-Muslim politics and trying to sort of figure out which side is more aligned with its interests that fundamentally are rooted, I think, in internal Israeli politics on the West Bank. And very much benefiting in many ways. Israel also benefits because now global attention is not on the Israel-Palestine conflict. When we talked about the Middle East, you know, not too long ago, the Middle East and the conflict in the Middle East was about Israel-Palestine. Now it's all about other issues. And the biggest beneficiary of that is right-wing Zionist narratives. And so Netanyahu loves this particular unfolding of events because no one cares about what's happening to the Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. It's not a priority. Who cares? There's other more pressing issues. So I think that's where Israel fits into this equation.
I'll just add one footnote to that, which is, Nader is correct. Israel is not directly involved in this sectarianization process. But, as Paul has recently commented, Saudi Arabia's intervention into the Lebanese theater now in recent weeks could bring Israel into a new conflict with Hezbollah. And it's not because of the sectarian issues that do in fact now drive the Saudi-Iranian rivalry vis-a-vis Lebanon, vis-a-vis other Yemen and so forth. It's not because of that that Israel would get involved, but this could be an unintended consequence. There could be another Israeli-Hezbollah conflict that the Saudis, for their sectarian reasons, might actually trigger.
And I mean, one would have to say, I mean, for Israel, let me just say one comment about Israel. I mean, for Israel, I mean, their fear of Iran is pretty straightforward because Iran pretty straightforwardly declares Israel, you know, an absolute enemy that they want to destroy and whatnot, and they, you know, Hezbollah says the same thing. That's part of kind of Iran's foreign policy and security, you know, announced policy. So for the Israelis, I get it. I mean, they see this big Iran, and it's not so much are they Shia or they Sunni, but you know, they're a declared enemy. But time is running short. There was that very interesting question about how do you define sectarianism? Is it just another identity politics, or is it different?
I mean, no, it's a good question. We fundamentally define it as an intra-Muslim set of identity cleavages that are fundamentally rooted in Sunni versus Shia identity mobilization and clashes.
For purposes of this book.
For purposes of the book, yeah. There are other definitions of sectarianism, but the one that we use as a founding sort of point of departure is that a sect presupposes there is some common overarching sort of religious identity that unites different subsects, and then within that overarching umbrella framework, there are different schools of thought or different sort of branches that sort of come into clash with one another for reasons that we talked about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the book is not about sectarianism in general. It's about the specific explosion of sectarian violence that is now engulfing the Middle East. I mean, that's really the issue. We're not so much interested in the complex histories of Sunni-Shia relations going back centuries, which is a fascinating, you know, area of research. That's not what our book is about. Our book is about specifically how the politics of sectarian violence, which has intensified so dramatically over the last several years, how this process is poisoning the politics of the Middle East today and how it can be reversed.
Thank you. In the few minutes left, any questions in the back there? Just the microphone.
Oh.
Thank you.
The one word that was not mentioned in this excellent presentation is education. Where is education has to do with this? The simple answers is either Islamic or anti-Islamic statements. If there is good education, I don't mean memorizing the textbook and getting a degree from college. I mean critical thinking. Where is it in the state of affairs we are in this area?
No, it's a
Thank you.
I am
Let's
from
get
Egypt.
another question.
I'm an
and then-
educator, and I know how bad education was 30 years ago, but it is much worse now.
Thank you. And the last question, gentleman behind you.
Yes, I have a comment and a provocative question. The comment, you observed that that nationalism, Arab nationalism was not very deep among the Arabs. I think it's interesting that the one group for which it was relatively deep would have been the Palestinians, and of course they're the ones who were most disenchanted by the failure of the '67 war.
Yeah.
Now my question is this. The one thing that you didn't discuss here, and given your interest in the violent conflict aspect of the sectarian question, I would like you to address, and you can tell me if it's addressed in the book, and that is the role played in, or the effect of the Western governments who advised the resistance in Syria to respond to to Assad's violence with armed resistance. Because, you know, even though correctly said there was no ISIS at the time, but certainly there was a fear of sectarianism in the broader sense of the word, that if there were an armed resistance and if there were an overthrow of the Assad government, that Christians, Shias, Alawis, various groups that in fact were the victims of ISIS would be at risk. So
Thank
I
you.
think that that's an interesting question.
We have just a couple of minutes, so very telegraphic responses.
Sure. Excellent point about the role of education. You said it was bad 30 years ago. It's worse today, and it's going to get worse as we move forward. You can't have critical education where people can think in healthy ways in the context of state authoritarian policies that have a deliberate interest in educating their people in a particular way to preserve the shelf life of these ruling elites. So you can't have free and open education when you don't have people who are involved and who are responsible for promoting education, who are scared of open debate, discussion, and dissent, which is why this recent claim by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia that he wants to promote moderate Islam should be held with deep suspicion, because if that was true, then you would have open debates in Saudi Arabia, promotion of foundational texts and interpretations that would allow for these types of moderate Islam interpretations to come forward. That's not happening, and so there's no hope for critical education in the context of political authoritarianism. The point about Arab nationalism, I think, is an interesting one. I would say that pan-Arab nationalism at one point was the heyday. I think I disagree a little bit with Danny in terms of how popular it was. But nationalism is still very much part of the political reality of the Arab world, much more in the context of state-based nationalisms, Palestinian nationalism, who aspire to an independent state, but also the different nationalisms of the nation states that we see. And we saw that in the Arab Spring uprisings. The national flag of all of the countries was prominent in all of those demonstrations. So that form of nationalism, I think, is still very much rooted in the politics and the political identities of most people. But the pan-Arab nationalist Nasser version has basically passed from the scene.
Thank you, Nader. Last word.
Syria, the Syrian
Danny?
one?
Well, on the Syrian point, the Syrian protest movement did not take up arms because the West told it to. The Syrian protest movement was nonviolent for several months, and the introduction of armed force into those protests was an indigenous grassroots decision, and a very defensive one. After months of being shot at, of being arrested, detained, tortured, disappeared, disfigured, having demonstrations crushed, having bread lines bombed, having schools bombed, having people maimed, the Syrian opposition, the protesters decided that they needed to defend themselves. And in fact, the very first instances of armed resistance were at demonstrations. They were armed protesters who were protecting other protesters. And then, of course, you have the Free Syrian Army forms out of defectors from the Assad regime. So this is an internal Syrian story. To imagine that the Syrian resistance becomes armed because the West told it to is not only empirically wrong, but frankly, it's an imperial fantasy because it deprives the Syrians of their own agency. It's just simply not the case. Now, then, after there is an armed Syrian resistance, then foreign powers get directly involved, and we know how that story went. We know that Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and various countries, and let's not forget the role of the Iranians. Everyone loves to talk about the foreign fighters, which is code for Sunni jihadis. There's another group of foreign fighters, the transnational Shia jihad that Iran has orchestrated, which involves the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, Iraqi Shia militias, Hezbollah, Pakistani mercenaries, Afghan children sent by Iran to fight in Syria. That jihad is rarely mentioned in that discussion. And the arms that are provided, the air power provided by Russia, the direct military boots on the ground provided by Iran and Hezbollah, which is a death squad in Syria that kills civilians, this is never mentioned. So I'm sorry, but I not only do I disagree factually with what you said, but I find it insulting to the Syrian people to suggest that they took up arms because of the West. It's a preposterous and frankly dehumanizing proposition.
Well, I look forward to reading the book. I was only able to look at it fleetingly. I encourage you to buy it. It's on sale outside. I think it's really a valuable contribution.
Thank you.
And thank you both for coming here. Please join me in thanking Nader Hashemi and Danny Postel.
Thank you, Paul.